The lawyer's hands were trembling slightly as he placed the thick folder on my oak coffee table. That was the first sign something was deeply wrong, because high-paid corporate attorneys simply do not shake. 5 days earlier, I had buried a secret worth $80 million. A secret powerful enough to unravel a web of deceit. Now, Hannah was standing in the middle of my living room with a smug smile, her sharp-suited lawyer right beside her. They looked at 12-year-old Aaron playing with his wooden blocks on the rug, and Hannah calmly stated she was having him moved to a state facility. She thought the game was over. She thought she was taking everything. She had no idea my grandmother had left me a loaded gun hidden in plain sight. Have you ever had someone look at you like you were nothing, while trying to steal everything you love? Drop a comment with where you're listening from tonight. The air in the living room felt suddenly thin, as if a sudden change in atmospheric pressure had sucked all the oxygen out through the open terrace doors. Outside, the heavy waves of Monterey Bay crashed against the jagged coastal rocks, a rhythmic, violent sound that I had listened to my entire life. Inside, there was only the suffocating silence left in the wake of Hannah's threat. My 12-year-old cousin was sitting on the woven rug, carefully stacking his wooden alphabet blocks, completely absorbed in his own quiet, beautiful world. He had a specialized medical port hidden beneath his collar, and his life depended on the sterile, climate-controlled environment my grandmother had built for him here. Hannah knew this. She knew exactly what she was threatening to dismantle. As a marine biologist, I have spent thousands of hours diving in open, deep waters, often surrounded by apex predators. The very first lesson you learn in the dark water is that panic is what kills you. If you thrash, if you scream, if you show fear, you become prey, lowering my heart rate. I steadied my breathing and held my ground, treating Hannah exactly like a predator circling a cage. I did not raise my voice or beg her to be reasonable. Begging is the language of the powerless, and I was far from powerless. Stepping smoothly between her and Aaron, I deliberately broke her line of sight to the boy. The sharp-suited lawyer cleared his throat, adjusting his silk tie as if the tension in the room was suddenly making him sweat. Pushing the thick leather folder closer to the edge of the table, he claimed it was a standard relinquishment of estate rights. He suggested it would be much easier for everyone if I just signed the property over to Hannah and Asher, ensuring a smooth transition. He actually used the phrase smooth transition, as if they were taking over a corporate lease and not destroying a child's sanctuary. Letting the silence stretch, I allowed it to grow heavy and uncomfortable. I watched the lawyer shift his weight from one expensive leather shoe to the other, meeting Hannah's cold, calculating eyes. I stated firmly that Eleanor's estate was not a bargaining chip, and Aaron's life was not a line item on her new financial portfolio. I instructed the lawyer to pick up his folder, put it back in his briefcase, and walk out the front door before I called the local authorities to report a trespassing violation on private property. Hannah's fake, polite smile completely vanished. The mask slipped, revealing the raw, ugly greed underneath. She glared at me, her chest heaving slightly, realizing for the first time that I was not the obedient, quiet girl she thought she had trained. Turning on her heel, her designer shoes clicked sharply against the hardwood floor. The lawyer scrambled to grab his useless documents and hurried after her like an obedient shadow, remaining completely still until the heavy oak front door slammed shut. I did not look back. The lingering scent of Hannah's heavy, expensive perfume instantly transported me back to a memory from 6 weeks earlier. It was the morning of Eleanor's funeral. The coastal fog had rolled in thick over Monterey Bay, blanketing the estate in a cold, gray mist that matched the hollow feeling in my chest. The scent of burning incense mixed with the distant, mournful chiming of the bronze wind bells hanging from the terrace. I stood near the edge of the cliffside garden, watching the gathering of mourners in their dark coats. Among them was Asher, the man who was supposed to be my protector, leaning so heavily on Hannah that he looked physically incapable of standing on his own. Asher looked frail, entirely consumed by a grief that seemed to have erased whatever backbone he once possessed. Hannah, on the other hand, was performing the role of the devoted, sorrowful wife with terrifying perfection. She dabbed at dry eyes with a black lace handkerchief, murmuring comforting words to anyone who walked past. Yet, whenever she thought no one was paying attention, the sorrow evaporated from her posture. Catching her cornering the director of a local marine research institute near the catering tables, I realized she was not accepting condolences. She was casually, yet persistently, asking questions about coastal property zoning laws, commercial real estate values, and how quickly land could be liquidated if an academic trust were to be dissolved. She was appraising the very ground we stood on while the woman who built it had barely been laid to rest. It was a sickening display of predatory calculation. Autumn had spent 40 years building this sanctuary, creating a legacy of marine conservation that protected not just the ocean, but the vulnerable people who lived on its shores. Hannah did not care about marine life. She only saw acres of prime California real estate waiting to be turned into a luxury resort or a massive payout. Remembering how Asher nodded along vacantly as Hannah whispered poison into his ear, isolating him from old friends. I wondered how a man could be so blind to the venomous nature of the woman holding his arm. I wondered if he even realized his new wife was mentally pricing out the dining room chairs while he was mourning his mother. The manipulation was so smooth that it almost looked like love to an untrained eye. But I knew better, keeping my face perfectly neutral. I simply watched her map out her hostile takeover. I let her believe she was the smartest person in the garden. She was fundamentally, completely wrong. Later that same afternoon, as the funeral guests began to slowly filter out of the estate, the trajectory of my life permanently shifted, retreating to the quiet solitude of Eleanor's expansive mahogany library. I sought a momentary escape from the suffocating presence of Hannah. The library smelled of old paper, polished wood, and dried sea salt. I was tracing the spine of an old encyclopedia when the heavy double doors clicked shut behind me. Turning around, I saw Olive, the sharp, silver-haired attorney who had handled the family's legal affairs for 3 decades. Olive was not a woman who wasted time on empty pleasantries. She possessed a formidable, steely grace that commanded respect in any courtroom. Walking directly toward me, her heels making no sound on the thick Persian rug. She did not offer a hug or hand me a stack of legal documents to review. Instead, she reached into the pocket of her tailored blazer and pulled out a small, heavy brass safe key. Attached to it was a thick paper tag bearing a strange, 10-digit alphanumeric code. Pressing the cold metal into my palm, she closed my fingers around it. The weight of it felt immense, anchoring me to the present moment. Looking down at my hand, confused, I tried to process what this meant amidst the overwhelming exhaustion of the day. Stepping closer. Olive's voice dropped to a low, urgent whisper that demanded absolute attention. She told me that Autumn had known this storm was coming long before the illness took her. My grandmother had spent the last year of her life quietly preparing for a war she knew she would not be here to fight. Olive instructed me to keep the key completely hidden. I was not to mention it to Asher, and absolutely never to Hannah. Acting the part of the grieving, naive granddaughter, I was simply to wait. Asking her what I was waiting for. Olive's expression hardened into something resembling a warrior's resolve. She told me to wait until Hannah made her first aggressive move to seize the estate. She warned me that Hannah would eventually become overconfident, that her greed would force her hand. Only when the illusion of family peace was shattered, only when the mask fully dropped, was I to use the key and the code. Olive promised me that Autumn had left behind exactly what I would need to defend the sanctuary. But the timing had to be flawless. Gripping the brass key so tightly that it dug into my skin, a strange, chilling calm washed over my grief. I slipped the key away. To understand the sheer cruelty of Hannah's actions, you have to understand the world she was trying to destroy. 12 years ago, my aunt passed away, leaving behind a boy with a severe, complex medical condition and no father in the picture. Asher, consumed by his own business failures, offered nothing but empty sympathy. It was Autumn who stepped in, without a single moment of hesitation. She brought Aaron to the Monterey estate and transformed an entire wing of the historic house into a state-of-the-art medical sanctuary. Aaron's world was fragile, meticulously constructed, and profoundly beautiful. Because of his condition, his immune system was practically non-existent, requiring 24-hour monitoring. Autumn had installed hospital-grade air filtration systems, specialized climate controls, and a dedicated power grid that ran independent of the main house. But she refused to let his life feel clinical. She painted his walls the color of the shallow ocean. She built a massive, reinforced glass observation window so he could watch the waves crash against the cliffs without ever feeling the harsh wind. Aaron communicated mostly through soft hums and the elaborate structures he built with his wooden blocks. This estate was not just a home to him, it was his life support system. Moving him to a standard state facility, as Hannah had casually threatened, was not merely an inconvenience. It was a death sentence. The public system lacked the highly specialized care that kept him breathing. Hannah knew all of this. During her brief visits over the past year, she had walked past Aaron's wing with a look of pure, unfiltered disgust. She saw his specialized equipment not as life-saving necessities, but as a massive drain on a fortune she believed she was entitled to. To her, Aaron was an obstacle. The $80 million Autumn had amassed through decades of marine patents and careful investments meant nothing if it was tied up in caring for a child who offered Hannah no social or financial return. Every morning, I would sit with Aaron, helping him guide his small hands to stack his blocks, watching his chest rise and fall in a steady, peaceful rhythm, protected by the invisible walls Autumn had built around him. The thought of Hannah's manicured hands tearing those walls down filled my mouth with the metallic taste of pure adrenaline. She viewed Aaron as the weakest link in the chain. She thought targeting a disabled orphan would force my hand. She severely miscalculated the depth of my resolve. She looked at Aaron and saw a vulnerability to be exploited. I looked at him and saw the very reason I had to become absolutely ruthless. The sanctuary would not fall. Looking back, many people have asked me why I did not immediately throw Hannah out the moment she first disrespected our home. Why did an educated, independent marine biologist tolerate the arrogant demands of a woman who clearly possessed no moral compass? The answer is buried in a psychological trap that so many children of fractured families understand perfectly. It is the invisible, suffocating chain of misplaced filial loyalty. I endured her presence because I was trying to protect the fragile remnants of my father. Asher had always been a man who crumbled under the weight of adversity. When my mother left us decades ago, he shattered. He became a ghost, walking through his own life, constantly searching for someone else to carry his emotional burdens. Autumn had carried him for years, and when her health began to fail, that immense weight silently transferred to me. Becoming the designated peacemaker, I absorbed the tension, swallowed the anger, and smiled through the discomfort just to ensure Asher did not spiral into another dark depression. When Hannah swept into his life, bringing her loud, superficial energy, Asher clung to her like a drowning man to a piece of driftwood. He looked happier than he had in years, completely blinded by her calculated affection. Challenging her, exposing her petty cruelties and endless demands for expensive gifts, would have forced Asher to confront the reality of his terrible choices. It would have broken him again, taking the path of least resistance. I normalized the toxicity. I let her make passive-aggressive comments about my career, swallowing the bitter taste of resentment. I believed that bearing the burden of a fake peace was simply the price of being a good daughter. This is the cruelty of being the responsible child. You convince yourself that your endurance is an act of love. You believe that if you just stay quiet, you can hold the fractured pieces of your family together. But it is a devastating illusion. My silence did not protect Asher. It only emboldened his captor. By tolerating Hannah's minor transgressions, I had unintentionally signaled that our boundaries were negotiable. Standing in the living room after she threatened Aaron, the invisible chain finally snapped, realizing with absolute terrifying clarity that protecting Asher's fragile ego was costing me the safety of an innocent child. The illusion of family unity dissolved. I had been playing the role of the quiet, accommodating daughter for so long that Hannah actually believed it was my true nature. She mistook my forced patience for inherent weakness. She thought my silence meant surrender. She was about to learn a devastating lesson about the ocean. Still waters run impossibly deep. 2 days after the lawyer left my living room, the silent invasion officially began. Awakened at dawn by the grumble of a diesel engine at the far edge of the estate, I looked through the observation glass to see 3 men in reflective vests driving wooden stakes into the coastal rocks. They were surveying the property lines, calculating the exact square footage of my grandmother's legacy. Hannah was wasting absolutely no time, treating the estate as if it were already listed on the commercial real estate market. By late afternoon, a highly formal email appeared in my inbox. The sender address belonged to Asher, but the cold, corporate sentence structure was undeniably Hannah's. The message stated that, as the rightful heir, Asher would immediately initiate a comprehensive financial audit of the estate's operating costs. Attached was a spreadsheet highlighting what the email termed wasteful ancillary expenses. Opening the document, a freezing chill ran down my spine. The highlighted rows were not for landscaping or main house maintenance. They were invoices for Aaron's specialized medical equipment, his 24-hour nursing staff, and the upkeep of his environmental control systems. Hannah was systematically building a paper trail to argue that Aaron was an unreasonable financial burden on the estate. She was preparing legal justifications to throw a disabled 12-year-old out of his only safe haven. Analyzing every word and carefully fabricated excuse, the audacity of using my father's name to execute this cruelty was staggering. Asher would never know how to format a spreadsheet, let alone draft a legally binding financial audit notice. He was merely a hollow shell Hannah was using to legitimize her greed. However, scrutinizing the attached documents, I noticed something her arrogance had missed. The digital signature on the audit request was time-stamped, cross-referencing that exact moment with Asher's public schedule. I found that during the minute my father supposedly authorized this brutal financial review, he was at a local dental clinic enduring a 3-hour root canal. He was heavily sedated, miles away from any computer or mobile device. Hannah had blatantly forged his electronic authorization. It was a sloppy mistake born from her absolute certainty that I would never dare investigate the details. I did not reply to the email. I did not call Asher to confront him. Instead, printing every page and capturing screenshots of the metadata, I saved everything into a secure, encrypted folder. Hannah thought she was tightening a noose around my neck. She had no idea she was handing me her own death warrant. Watching the surveyors outside pack up their equipment as the sun dipped below the dark waves of the Pacific, I knew the tide was turning. The very next morning, Hannah's silent invasion escalated into a direct assault. Working in the marine biology lab analyzing ocean salinity reports, the entire estate suddenly plunged into an eerie darkness. The low, constant hum of the facility's central power grid vanished. For a quarter of a second, I assumed a coastal storm had damaged the local transformers. But looking outside, there was no wind or rain, just a brilliant California sky. A realization hit me with the force of physical violence. The main house could withstand a power outage, but Aaron's annex absolutely could not. Sprinting across the courtyard, my heart hammered against my ribs. Aaron's environmental systems were equipped with a heavy-duty backup generator, but it was designed to automatically engage only during a city-wide grid failure. If the power had been manually severed at the main breaker, the backup system might not trigger. Bursting through the doors of his annex, I found the medical staff frantically checking the dead monitors. The specialized air filtration system, essential for keeping his sterile environment free of lethal pathogens, was completely paralyzed. Aaron sat on his bed, his eyes wide with confusion, clutching a wooden block tightly to his chest. I bolted toward the main electrical utility station at the edge of the property. The heavy steel door, usually secured with a safety padlock, stood wide open. Inside were two private contractors wearing the same logo as the surveyors from the previous day. One of them held massive industrial cable cutters, demanding an explanation with lethal calm. The older man casually wiped his hands on his jeans and handed me a printed work order. It bore Hannah's signature. The order explicitly directed the severing of high-voltage lines feeding the annex, citing an emergency need to eliminate unlicensed electrical hazards. Hannah had intentionally cut the power feeding a child's life support system under the guise of estate maintenance. She knew exactly what that annex was for. She knew the backup generators required a manual override if the main breaker was destroyed. This was not bureaucratic negligence. This was a calculated, staged accident meant to terrorize me into immediate submission. She wanted me to believe she held the power of life and death over the one person I swore to protect. Ordering the contractors off the property immediately, I informed them they had just illegally tampered with critical medical infrastructure. As they scrambled to their truck in a panic, I manually engaged the emergency generators. The deep roar of the backup engines ignited, and the filtration systems in Aaron's room slowly hummed back to life. Standing in the utility station, staring at the severed power cables, my hands shook, not from fear, but from an absolute, freezing rage. My misguided attempt to maintain a fake family peace had nearly cost an innocent boy his life. The appeasement was officially over. I spent the next 48 hours operating entirely in the shadows. The incident at the utility station had stripped away any lingering hesitation. Hannah had shown her hand, and now it was time to systematically dismantle her foundation. Refusing to engage in screaming matches or send threatening texts, I treated her like a complex oceanic parasite that needed to be isolated, studied, and eradicated. My first step was tracing the financial arteries of the estate, to see exactly how much control she had wrested from Asher. Sitting at the massive oak desk in Eleanor's library, surrounded by decades of tax returns and legal correspondence, I contacted the primary financial institutions where Asher held his personal accounts. Because my name remained on the emergency contact list for his older portfolios, I secured basic administrative logs without triggering security alerts. What I uncovered was a masterpiece of methodical, quiet manipulation. Hannah had not simply married my father, she had completely erased his financial autonomy. Over the past 8 months, Hannah had officially redirected all of Asher's physical and electronic mail to a private post office box registered exclusively under her name. Every bank statement, tax notice, and legal document concerning the estate had been intercepted and filtered before Asher ever saw them. She had essentially placed him in financial quarantine. Furthermore, she had slowly liquidated 3 of his smaller, independent investment accounts, moving the capital into a newly formed limited liability company. Registered in Delaware, a state infamous for shielding anonymous corporate ownership, the sole acting manager was Hannah. She wasn't just waiting to inherit Eleanor's wealth, actively draining Asher's resources while positioning herself to swallow the $80 million, she was building an impenetrable fortress of paperwork. She felt confident Asher was too emotionally shattered to notice the missing funds, and certain I was too weak to dig into the details. She assumed I was a naive scientist who preferred the company of marine life over navigating corporate law. Printing out the change of address forms, the Delaware incorporation papers, and the logs of the liquidated accounts, I organized them into sterile, clear plastic sleeves, building a definitive timeline of her fraud. Each document became a nail in the coffin she was constructing for herself. Confronting Asher with this information now would be useless. Hannah had brainwashed him so thoroughly, he would likely defend her actions. I needed a far more devastating weapon to break her grip. It was time to use the key. Delving deeper into the estate's financial archives, the true scale of what Hannah was attempting to steal came into razor-sharp focus. Growing up, I always knew my grandmother was wealthy, but she rarely spoke of money. To me, her wealth was simply the invisible infrastructure that kept the research center running and provided a safe harbor for Aaron. But as I reviewed the confidential asset ledgers locked in the bottom drawer of her desk, the reality of the $80 million valuation finally made sense. It wasn't just liquid cash or the surface area of the Monterey Bay property. The vast majority of Eleanor's legacy was tied to a series of highly lucrative, exclusive marine conservation patents. She had funded pioneering research in biofiltration systems and sustainable aquaculture technology. These patents were actively leased by some of the world's largest environmental engineering firms. The estate was fundamentally a self-sustaining financial powerhouse, generating millions in passive revenue annually. This was the real prize Hannah had discovered. She didn't just want to sell a beautiful house on a cliff. She had found a goldmine of intellectual property. I located a carefully encrypted digital folder on Eleanor's internal server containing recent correspondence with a massive international hotel conglomerate. The emails were dated just weeks before Autumn passed away. The conglomerate had relentlessly tried to acquire the coastal land to develop a luxury eco-resort. Autumn had firmly rejected every offer, stating clearly that the land and patents were bound by conservation and charitable trusts. But there was a newer email thread, one Autumn had never seen. It was a chain of messages between the hotel conglomerate's acquisition director and Hannah. Utilizing Asher's email account, Hannah had quietly reopened negotiations. She was actively promising the developers that the estate would undergo an ownership restructuring in the very near future. She even attached a preliminary valuation of the marine patents, casually suggesting they could be bundled into the land sale. Hannah was essentially negotiating a corporate liquidation of Eleanor's life's work, preparing to bulldoze Aaron's sanctuary to make way for infinity pools and expensive bars. The sheer scale of her greed was staggering. Leaning back in the heavy leather chair, staring at the glowing screen of the laptop, the pieces perfectly aligned. Hannah's rush to push me out of the house, the attempt to cut the power to Aaron's wing, the manipulation of Asher's finances. It was all a desperate sprint to close a multi-million-dollar real estate deal before anyone could intervene. She thought she had crafted the perfect scheme. She forgot about the architect. The following afternoon, I drove into the city, seeking out the discreet, unmarked brick building housing Olive's legal practice. The air inside the office was thick with the scent of dark roasted coffee and aged leather, a sharp contrast to the salty breeze of the coastal estate. Olive sat behind her massive, cluttered desk, intensely reviewing a thick stack of legal briefs. She did not look surprised to see me standing in her doorway. In fact, she looked exactly like a general silently waiting for a scout to return from the front lines. Walking across the room, I reached into my pocket and placed the heavy brass safe key dead center on her desk. The metal block made a dull, decisive thud against the wood. Skipping any long, emotional explanations, I simply handed her the printed copies of Hannah's forged audit requests, the Delaware corporate filings, and the leaked emails with the hotel conglomerate. Spreading them out side by side, they formed a silent, undeniable testament to the hostile takeover unfolding right under Asher's nose. Olive picked up her reading glasses, pushing them down the bridge of her nose as she meticulously examined each document. She did not gasp or express any outrage. She processed them with the cold, clinical precision of an apex predator analyzing its prey. Finishing her review, she carefully aligned the edges of the papers and looked up at me. Her expression was a complex blend of grim satisfaction and profound sorrow. Leaning back in her chair, pressing her fingertips together, her eyes locked onto mine. She told me that Autumn had predicted this exact sequence of events. My grandmother knew Hannah's greed would not permit her to wait for a natural transfer of power. Autumn had warned Olive that Hannah would attempt to isolate Asher, manipulate the finances, and ultimately target Aaron to force a rapid asset liquidation. Olive explained that everything I had just uncovered was merely the necessary confirmation to trigger the final phase of Eleanor's plan. The key on the desk was no longer just a piece of brass. It was the trigger for a devastating legal mechanism. Asking Olive what resided inside the safe that required such elaborate secrecy, she picked up the key, turning it slowly under the dim light of her desk lamp. She revealed that Autumn had spent her final months constructing an impenetrable fortress, a legal structure so watertight that even the most expensive corporate litigators could not pierce it. But before we could deploy it, we needed to retrieve the physical documents. We needed to open the subterranean vault. Olive stood up, smoothed her impeccably tailored blazer, and picked up her briefcase. It was time to go to war. Returning to the estate long after the sun had sunk below the horizon, the house was utterly silent, save for the endless, rhythmic sound of waves crashing against the cliffs outside. Walking down the dimly lit corridor of the annex, I pushed open the heavy door to Aaron's room. The specialized air filtration system emitted a soothing, steady hum like a lullaby. Aaron was fast asleep, his small chest rising and falling peacefully beneath a thick ocean blue wool blanket. Pulling a chair to his bedside, I quietly watched him, feeling a profound, immense weight settle deep into my bones. Looking at this small, fragile boy, I realized how violently the world misunderstood the concept of family. Society dictates that blood is an unbreakable bond, an automatic guarantee of loyalty and protection. Yet Asher shared my DNA, and he was currently sleeping in the main house, entirely blind to the fact that his new wife was actively conspiring to destroy this child's life. Asher's blood did not make him braver. It did not grant him protective instincts. It only made him a cowardly, convenient tool for a predator. Family is not determined by genetics, and inheritance is not a biological privilege. Family is defined by the people who step forward to shield you when the storm hits. Autumn had no biological obligation to adopt Aaron when his mother passed away. She owed him nothing. Still, she spent millions building this sanctuary, ensuring a boy incapable of fighting for himself would never have to. She chose him, sitting in the quiet hum of the medical monitors. I finally grasped the massive scale of what she had passed down to me. She hadn't merely left me an $80 million estate or a portfolio of marine patents. She had handed me a profound moral responsibility. Inheriting her wealth meant inheriting the duty to protect the vulnerable. If I surrendered to Hannah, walking away to save myself from an ugly conflict, I would inevitably betray the very definition of love Autumn had taught me. Looking at Aaron's small, relaxed hands resting on the blanket, I knew he trusted the walls around him completely, entirely unaware of the vicious corporate war threatening to tear them down. Reaching out, I gently tucked the edge of the blanket around his shoulders. I promised him, in the absolute silence of that room, that no lawyer, no forged document, and no manipulative stepmother would ever force him out of this sanctuary. I would tear Hannah's world apart piece by piece before letting her touch a single brick of this building. Standing up, a cold, crystal-clear resolve replaced the last remnants of my grief. Turning off the small nightlight, I stepped out into the dark hallway. The waiting was finally over. The formal envelope arrived the next morning, delivered by a private courier who aggressively demanded a physical signature. Standing in the bright, sunlit kitchen, listening to the distant crash of the waves against the cliffs, I sliced the thick paper open with a cold steel paring knife. Inside was a demand letter, drafted on the heavy, embossed letterhead of Hannah's newly hired corporate attorney. The sheer audacity of the document was staggering. It was not just a polite request to vacate the premises or a demand for a financial negotiation. It was a strict 72-hour ultimatum, specifically targeting the most vulnerable person in my life. Hannah had formally petitioned to have Aaron declared a ward of the state. The letter used sickeningly sterile, clinical language to mask its profound cruelty. It claimed that the isolated coastal estate was an improper and financially irresponsible environment for a child with such complex medical needs. It brazenly suggested that a public, state-run care facility would be far more suitable for his long-term rehabilitation. They dressed up their predatory greed in the polite language of false compassion. Reading the words regarding the best interest of the minor, my vision physically narrowed. Hannah was giving me exactly 3 days to sign over my administrative rights to the estate. Or she would file an emergency legal injunction to have Aaron physically removed by state authorities. She was holding an innocent, disabled child hostage to force a massive real estate transaction. She knew Aaron's immune system could never survive the transition to a crowded public ward. But she simply did not care. To her, his life was just collateral damage on the way to cashing out $80 million. Analyzing the specific legal threats and hollow justifications, I realized Hannah possessed no moral boundaries whatsoever. She was entirely comfortable destroying a child if it meant upgrading her lifestyle. She expected me to fold immediately. She expected me to panic, to call Asher crying, to beg for mercy, and ultimately to sign whatever papers she put in front of me just to keep Aaron safe. She thought she had found the perfect leverage to break my spirit. Carefully folding the heavy paper and sliding it back into the envelope, I did not shed a single tear, and my hands were perfectly steady. The time for maintaining a polite, fractured family dynamic was over. She had crossed a line from which there was absolutely no return. Walking over to the kitchen counter, I picked up my phone and prepared to answer her 72-hour deadline. The countdown had officially begun. I did not panic. Instead, dialing Olive's private number, I informed her the ultimatum had arrived. She promised to be at the estate in exactly 20 minutes. When she pulled into the driveway, we did not sit in the parlor to strategize. Olive instructed me to grab a heavy flashlight and lead the way down to Eleanor's subterranean wine cellar, built deep into the dense coastal bedrock beneath the main house in the 1920s. The cellar smelled intensely of damp earth, aged oak barrels, and the faint, salty brine of the ocean seeping through ancient stone. Walking past rows of dusty vintage bottles, we reached the furthest, darkest wall of the underground chamber. Hanging there was a heavy, unremarkable landscape painting of a stormy ocean. Olive gestured for me to pull the heavy canvas down. Behind the painting was a solid steel panel, set perfectly flush with the cold stone. Pulling the heavy brass key from my pocket, the one I had carried every single day since the funeral, I inserted it into the discreet lock. The metal mechanism engaged with a satisfying click, but the door did not open. Instead, a small panel slid back, revealing a glowing digital biometric scanner and a numerical keypad. Autumn had never trusted simple locks or basic security. Handing me a small slip of paper, Olive watched as I carefully punched in the 10-digit code she had given me weeks ago. The vault beeped twice, a sharp sound in the quiet cellar, and the heavy steel door hissed open, breaking a tight vacuum seal. The air inside the safe was dry, smelling faintly of old paper and ozone. Inside sat a single, massive, leather-bound portfolio, practically bursting with documents. It was labeled simply with a Roman numeral 2. Reaching inside, I pulled the heavy portfolio out into the dim light of the flashlight. It felt like holding the entire weight of my grandmother's brilliant, calculating mind. Autumn knew her wealth would attract predators, and she had spent her final year quietly constructing a trap. Looking at Olive, whose face was illuminated by the harsh beam, she gave me a single, grim nod of approval. The physical evidence we needed to destroy Hannah's hostile takeover was finally in our hands. Standing in the freezing, damp cellar, we held the key to a legal war Hannah had no idea she was about to fight. I opened the heavy lid. Carrying the heavy leather portfolio upstairs to the dining room, I placed it on the long mahogany table. Olive stood silently by the massive bay window, watching the turbulent waves, allowing me the quiet space to open the box myself. It was not a simple collection of bank statements or basic property deeds. The very first thing I pulled out was a 200-page dossier compiled by a highly exclusive corporate private intelligence firm. Autumn had hired them 14 months ago, right after Asher first brought his new girlfriend to Sunday dinner. Reading the executive summary, the true, horrifying shape of the woman who married my father came into razor-sharp focus. Hannah was not just a greedy opportunist who got lucky with a grieving widower. She was a career predator with a meticulously refined system. The dossier detailed her 2 previous marriages in terrifying, clinical detail. Her first husband was an older, wealthy commercial contractor in Nevada. After just 3 years of marriage, she quietly assumed his medical proxy during a minor illness, isolated him entirely from his adult children, and legally transferred his commercial properties into a holding company she solely controlled. He died alone in a substandard care facility, while she rapidly liquidated his lifelong assets. Her second marriage in Arizona followed the exact same ruthless playbook. It ended with a miraculously rewritten will and a quietly settled civil lawsuit from his devastated, bankrupt family. Autumn had tracked every single wire transfer, every offshore shell company, and every piece of fake medical documentation Hannah had ever weaponized against vulnerable men. Have you ever found a piece of evidence that perfectly confirmed your absolute worst gut feeling about a toxic person? Let me know your story in the comments below. My grandmother had documented over a decade of systemic, calculated elder abuse and financial fraud. Hannah had spent her entire adult life finding broken men, pretending to be their savior, and then bleeding them completely dry before moving on to the next target. Assuming Asher was just another easy mark, she figured I was just a naive scientist who would step aside out of a misplaced sense of family loyalty. She had severely underestimated the matriarch of this family. She picked the wrong target. Flipping frantically through the final, dense pages of the intelligence dossier, I felt a complex mixture of profound validation and rising anxiety. The proof of Hannah's criminal past was undeniable, but I was aggressively searching for the immediate weapon that would actually stop her today. Digging deeper into the leather portfolio, pushing aside the background checks and financial histories, I expected to find Eleanor's final, ironclad last will and testament. I expected a formal document clearly leaving the $80 million and the coastal estate solely in my name, allowing me to legally evict Hannah from our lives. But there was no will. Emptying the entire contents of the vault onto the polished dining table, I found property assessments, patent registrations, and detailed medical directives for Aaron. But the one central document required to navigate the local probate court was entirely missing. A cold spike of panic hit my chest. Looking up at Olive, confusion finally breaking through my carefully maintained calm, I asked her where the will was. If there was no will, the estate would automatically default to Asher as the surviving child, handing Hannah the keys to the kingdom. Smiling a slow, predatory expression that completely transformed her usually stoic face. Olive walked over to the table and tapped a thick stack of documents bound in dark blue legal backing. She explained that Autumn was far too intelligent to rely on something as vulnerable as a simple will. Wills have to go through a public probate process. Wills can be endlessly contested by greedy family members. Wills can be stalled for years by expensive lawyers claiming the deceased was coerced or not of sound mind. Autumn knew that if she left a traditional will, Hannah would immediately tie it up in ugly litigation until our legal fees bled the estate dry. She knew Hannah would use the slow wheels of the justice system to hold Aaron hostage in the meantime. So, my brilliant grandmother did not leave a will, She completely bypassed the entire probate system, engineering something infinitely more permanent. She created a mechanism that could never be challenged in a courtroom, no matter how many expensive lawyers Hannah hired. The money was legally gone. Sitting across from me, Olive carefully opened the blue-backed documents. She pointed a manicured finger to the bold header printed on the first page. It did not say Last Will and Testament. It read, Irrevocable Special Needs Trust. Leaning forward, her voice took on the precise, clinical tone of a law professor lecturing an advanced masterclass on estate preservation. She explained that when you place assets into an irrevocable trust, you legally and permanently surrender your personal ownership of them forever. Autumn had not simply designated me as her heir. 16 months before she died, before the cancer had even taken hold, she had legally transferred the deed to the $80 million coastal estate, all the liquid investment accounts, and every single highly lucrative marine patent directly into this specific trust. By the time my grandmother drew her last breath, she technically owned absolutely nothing. The trust owned everything. And because the trust is explicitly irrevocable, its terms cannot be altered, canceled, or contested by anyone. Not by Asher, and certainly not by his manipulative, newly wedded wife. The sole, heavily protected beneficiary of this massive financial fortress was 12-year-old Aaron. My role was clearly and legally defined in the dense pages of the document. I was not the owner of the wealth. I was the designated trustee. My strict legal and fiduciary duty was to manage the $80 million entirely for Aaron's ongoing medical care and the permanent preservation of his coastal sanctuary. If I tried to sell the estate, or if I let Hannah take it, I would be in violation of federal law. Hannah was aggressively demanding a slice of an estate that no longer legally existed in Asher's name or Eleanor's taxable history. She was threatening to evict a disabled child from a property that the child technically owned in full. The forged audit documents, the intimidating 72-hour ultimatums, the expensive lawyers she had hired, it was all completely useless. Waging a vicious, aggressive war against a financial ghost, she was punching at a brick wall of airtight corporate law that she could not even see. Closing the blue binder and sliding it across the table toward me, Olive made it clear the trap was set. Hannah had shown her hand, entirely unaware that she was sitting at a poker table where the house already owned all the chips. Have you ever discovered a secret that instantly turned your fear into cold, hard power? Let me know in the comments below. I spent the next 24 hours preparing for the mediation hearing with the cold, detached precision of a marine biologist setting up a highly sensitive laboratory experiment. I did not allow myself to feel anger, nor did I let the crushing anxiety about Aaron's future cloud my judgment. Anger makes you sloppy, and panic makes you rush. I needed to be absolutely flawless. Sitting at Eleanor's massive oak desk in the library, the only sound being the rhythmic crashing of the waves outside the heavy glass windows, I took the original documents Olive had provided and began to organize them. Placing the private intelligence dossier detailing Hannah's extensive history of financial fraud into a series of clear, sterile plastic sleeves, I indexed every single offshore account she had created. I cataloged every manipulated medical proxy she had used against her previous husbands, and the quiet civil settlements she had forced upon their grieving families, building a physical timeline of her predatory behavior. I ensured that no expensive corporate lawyer could ever argue that this was merely a series of unfortunate misunderstandings. Next, taking the thick, blue-backed binder containing the Irrevocable Special Needs Trust, I focused on the absolute core of our defense. I read through the dense legal language one final time, tracing the exact clauses naming Aaron as the sole, unchangeable beneficiary of the $80 million estate. It felt incredibly empowering to hold the physical manifestation of my grandmother's brilliant foresight. While Hannah had been busy sneaking around, measuring property lines and illegally redirecting Asher's mail, Autumn had already built an impenetrable fortress around us. Packing the binders into a heavy leather briefcase, I no longer felt like a victim. I felt like an architect who was about to watch a wrecking ball swing back and crush the person who threw it. Olive called me late in the afternoon to confirm that Hannah's legal team had agreed to an emergency mediation session at a neutral office downtown. They were eager to meet, entirely confident that they were about to pressure a naive, frightened young woman into signing away a historic coastal estate. They believed the ultimatum regarding Aaron had successfully broken my spirit. Thanking Olive for the confirmation, I hung up the phone. Walking down the hall to Aaron's room, I watched him peacefully arrange his wooden blocks, completely oblivious to the vicious corporate war being waged over his sanctuary. I promised him, in the quiet hum of his medical monitors, that this nightmare was about to end. Locking the heavy briefcase, my hands were perfectly steady. The trap was finally set. The mediation office was located in a sterile, modern glass building in the center of the city, designed specifically to feel neutral and intimidating. It smelled faintly of harsh chemical cleaners and stale, cheap coffee. The walls were painted a dull, lifeless gray, and the massive conference table in the center of the room was made of cold, frosted glass. Arriving 15 minutes early, Olive and I sat on one side of the long table, the heavy leather briefcase resting quietly on the floor by my feet. We did not speak. We simply waited in the chilling silence of the corporate room. Exactly at 10 o'clock, the heavy glass door swung open. Hannah walked in, radiating a sickening aura of absolute, unchecked arrogance. Wearing a sharply tailored charcoal suit, her hair pulled back into a severe, professional style, she carried herself like a conquering general stepping onto a freshly won battlefield. She did not even look at me. Asher trailed closely behind her, his shoulders slumped, his eyes refusing to meet mine. Looking exhausted and aged beyond his years, he was effectively reduced to a hollow prop in Hannah's grand performance. Beside them walked the sharp-suited attorney who had previously invaded my living room, carrying his own sleek designer briefcase. They took their seats across from us. The mediator, a retired, stern-looking judge, briefly outlined the rules of the session and invited Hannah's team to state their opening position. Her lawyer stood up, buttoned his expensive jacket, and launched into a highly rehearsed, deeply manipulative monologue. He did not mention his previous threat to throw Aaron into a state facility. Instead, he painted a tragic picture of a grieving widow and a heartbroken son who were simply trying to honor Eleanor's legacy through a fair and equitable distribution of her assets. Using the word fairness no less than 5 times in his opening statement, he argued that keeping an $80 million coastal estate tied up for the exclusive use of one disabled child was financially irresponsible. He claimed it constituted a massive breach of Asher's inherent rights as the sole surviving biological child. Hannah sat beside him, her hands folded neatly on the glass table, wearing an expression of deeply practiced, melancholic patience. She actually managed to look mournful while her lawyer actively argued to dismantle my grandmother's life's work. Sitting perfectly still, my hands resting in my lap, I maintained a completely neutral expression. I watched Asher stare blankly at his own hands, too defeated to even register the horrific nature of what his wife was demanding. They were so incredibly confident, believing they held all the leverage, and that my silence was a clear indicator of impending surrender. Olive glanced at me out of the corner of her eye, giving a tiny, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. We did not interrupt the lawyer's grand, self-righteous speech. We let them keep digging. When Hannah's lawyer finally concluded his lengthy, dramatic plea for equitable distribution, a heavy silence fell over the cold mediation room. The retired judge turned his attention to our side of the table, waiting for our official rebuttal. Olive did not stand up. She did not raise her voice or launch into an emotional defense of Aaron's medical needs. Simply leaning forward, she unclasped the heavy leather briefcase and pulled out the thick stack of intelligence files I had meticulously organized the night before. Placing the clear plastic sleeves onto the frosted glass table with a series of soft, deliberate slaps. Olive looked directly at Hannah, completely bypassing the expensive attorney. In a voice as sharp and cold as shattered ice, she began to read the timeline. She did not start with Eleanor's estate. Starting with a commercial contractor in Nevada, she read the man's name aloud. She detailed the exact date Hannah had assumed his medical proxy, the specific offshore holding companies she had created to drain his commercial assets, and the tragic, isolated circumstances of his death in a substandard public facility. Watching the color instantly drain from Hannah's face, I saw the smug, victorious smile vanish, replaced by rigid, terrified tension. Her posture stiffened, her hands gripping the edge of the glass table so tightly her knuckles turned white. Olive did not pause to let the shock settle. Calmly turning the page, she began detailing the second marriage in Arizona. She read the exact financial figures involved in the quiet civil lawsuit, exposing the massive, systemic fraud Hannah had perpetrated against a retired dentist and his bankrupt family. Olive laid out the bank transfers, the fake medical documents, and the intercepted mail. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Hannah's lawyer stared at the documents on the table, his mouth slightly open, clearly realizing his client had blatantly lied to him about her past. But it was Asher's reaction that truly shifted the gravity of the room. Slowly lifting his head, his tired eyes widened in absolute, unadulterated horror as he stared at the woman sitting next to him. He was hearing the exact blueprint of his own ongoing destruction, recognizing the intercepted mail, the sudden changes in his financial accounts, and the subtle isolation from his old friends. The horrific realization that he was simply target number 3 washed over him in real time. Opening his mouth to speak, to ask Hannah if this was true, no words came out. He just stared at her, physically trembling as the devastating illusion of his new marriage completely shattered. Hannah refused to look at him, her eyes darting frantically around the room, desperately looking for an escape route. The room fell completely silent. Hannah's lawyer was the first to recover from the sheer shock of the exposure. Frantically shuffling his own papers, his professional composure severely cracking, he loudly objected. He claimed that the private intelligence dossier was nothing more than highly defamatory slander, entirely irrelevant to the current division of Eleanor's estate. Aggressively insisting that past marriages had no legal bearing on Asher's inherent rights to the $80 million property, he demanded that we return to the matter of liquidating the coastal sanctuary. Hannah eagerly nodded along, her chest heaving, desperately trying to hide behind her attorney's legal bluster. That was when I finally spoke. My voice was steady, lacking any trace of the fear they had expected to hear. Looking at Hannah, I told her that we were not negotiating the division of the estate because there was absolutely nothing left to divide. Smoothly pulling the thick, blue-backed legal binder from the briefcase, Olive slid it across the frosted glass toward their side of the table. Watching the lawyer's eyes scan the bold heading Irrevocable Special Needs Trust, I explained in excruciatingly clear detail that Autumn did not leave a traditional will. 16 months before her death, she had legally transferred the deed to the property, the marine patents, and every single liquid asset directly into this airtight corporate structure. Autumn had died, technically owning nothing. The lawyer frantically flipped through the pages, his eyes darting across the dense, undeniable legal clauses, informing them that the trust was entirely irrevocable. I clarified it could not be contested, dissolved by a probate judge, or liquidated to satisfy the demands of a fraudulent stepmother. Aaron was the sole, permanent beneficiary. I was the legally bound trustee, mandated by federal law to protect the assets exclusively for his lifelong medical care. Watching the devastating reality wash over Hannah, I saw her realize the $80 million she had spent months manipulating Asher to acquire was completely untouchable. The massive coastal property she had secretly promised to an international hotel conglomerate was legally locked away behind a financial shield she could never breach. Her entire predatory campaign, the forged audits, the intercepted mail, the cruel ultimatums regarding Aaron's health was utterly useless. She had spent a year playing a vicious, calculated game of chess, only to discover that Autumn had flipped the entire board over long before the game even started. Burying his face in his hands, Asher's shoulders shook with silent, crushing sobs. Hannah's attorney slowly closed the blue binder, leaned back in his leather chair, and let out a long, defeated breath. He knew immediately that he had been dragged into a completely unwinnable war. Hannah sat frozen, her eyes wide, staring at the blue folder as if it were a physical weapon pointed directly at her chest. Her grand, hostile takeover had been fundamentally destroyed by a few dozen pages of flawless legal foresight. She had absolutely nothing left. The atmosphere in the mediation room was heavy with the scent of Hannah's absolute defeat. Her lawyer was actively packing his expensive briefcase, clearly eager to distance himself from a client who had hidden a massive history of corporate fraud and elder abuse. Still staring at the floor, Asher was completely broken by the horrific revelations, feeling a deep, profound sense of closure settling into my bones. I knew the $80 million sanctuary was safe. Aaron was safe. The war was supposed to be over. But a seasoned predator does not simply walk away when they are cornered. They lash out with whatever desperate weapons they have left. Suddenly, Hannah slammed her hand down on the frosted glass table, glaring at her attorney. She hissed at him to stop packing and ordered him to present the final document. The lawyer hesitated, looking deeply uncomfortable, but the sheer, venomous intensity in Hannah's eyes forced his hand. Reluctantly reaching into the side pocket of his briefcase, he pulled out a single, thin manila envelope. Sliding a newly printed document across the table, it was titled, Supplemental Testamentary Amendment. Hannah's lips curled into a vicious, triumphant smirk. Clearing his throat, his voice lacking its previous arrogant boom. The lawyer claimed this document had been recently discovered in Asher's personal safe. It was purportedly signed by Autumn exactly 3 weeks prior to her passing. According to the text, this legal amendment explicitly revoked all previous trusts, including the irrevocable Special Needs Trust, citing a sudden change in her mental clarity regarding Aaron's long-term care. It transferred immediate, total administrative control of the entire coastal estate directly to Asher. It was a breathtakingly audacious move. Hannah was attempting to deploy a false counterattack, a desperate, manufactured twist designed to invalidate the ironclad trust and throw the entire $80 million fortune back into the chaotic, easily manipulated arena of public probate court, thinking she had played the ultimate trump card. She stared at me, her eyes burning with malicious victory, waiting for the panic to finally set in. She expected me to crumble at the sight of my grandmother's signature, to realize that her fraudulent manipulation had outpaced Eleanor's careful planning. Looking down at the supplemental amendment, I stared at the highly stylized signature at the bottom of the page, supposedly written by a dying woman in her final weeks. The tension in the room spiked to a suffocating level as the retired judge leaned forward, his brow furrowed, silently analyzing the sudden introduction of a superseding legal document. Leaning back in her chair, crossing her arms, Hannah looked like a woman who had just successfully stolen the world. She thought her forged masterpiece had saved her entire predatory campaign. I smiled back at her, refusing to gasp when the fake document was presented. I did not raise my voice to accuse Hannah of a crime, nor did I slam my fists against the frosted glass table in a dramatic display of outrage. Panic is the ultimate weapon of the guilty, and I had absolutely nothing to be guilty of. Simply reaching into the heavy leather briefcase one final time, I pulled out a thick, plastic-sealed file bearing the official red crest of the Monterey Bay Regional Hospital. Instead of handing it to Hannah, I slid it directly across the table to her expensive, highly anxious attorney. Watching his eyes drop to the heavily stamped medical records, I told him, in a voice that barely registered above a whisper, to look very closely at the dates. I instructed him to cross-reference the exact day and time his client claimed my grandmother had miraculously rewritten her will, and compare it to the hospital's official daily intake logs. Flipping the page, his finger tracing the dense medical terminology, I calmly translated the clinical jargon for the rest of the room. On the exact afternoon, Hannah claimed Autumn had signed that supplemental amendment. My grandmother was lying in an intensive care unit, entirely sustained by machines. Having suffered a massive respiratory collapse, she had been placed into a medically induced coma to stabilize her failing lungs. She was unconscious, unresponsive, and physically incapable of holding a pen, let alone drafting a complex legal document to revoke an $80 million trust. The signature on Hannah's pristine piece of paper was not just a clumsy forgery. It was a blatant, highly documented act of felony fraud, committed against a dying woman. The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. The lawyer's face drained of all color, transforming from a pale pink to a sickly, terrifying ash white. Navigating civil disputes and corporate loopholes was his profession. He was not a man willing to sacrifice his lucrative career and face federal prison time for a client's criminal arrogance. Realizing in a fraction of a second that presenting that document had just made him an unwitting accessory to a massive criminal conspiracy, he did not argue. He did not attempt to defend her. Standing up so quickly, his heavy leather chair scraped violently against the floor. He shoved his papers into his briefcase, his hands visibly shaking now. He announced to the mediator that he was formally withdrawing as Hannah's legal counsel, effective immediately, citing irreconcilable ethical conflicts. He refused to even look at the woman who had hired him. Hannah sat frozen at the table, the smug, vicious smirk that had defined her existence for the past year completely melted away, leaving behind a hollow, terrified shell. Her ultimate, desperate counterattack had not just failed, it had triggered a trap she could never escape. She had handed us the exact physical proof needed to send her to prison. She had nowhere left to hide. Hannah's departure was entirely stripped of her usual theatrical grace. Left completely without legal representation and staring down the barrel of a massive felony fraud investigation. The terrifying reality of her situation finally broke through her arrogance. Gathering her designer purse with trembling hands, her sharp heels stumbled slightly as she practically sprinted out of the sterile mediation room. She did not ask Asher to come with her, not sparing him a single backward glance. She proved he was exactly what we all knew he was, to her a completely disposable asset that had ceased to be useful. Asher did not attempt to follow her. Remaining seated at the long glass table, his posture completely collapsed. He looked like a man who had survived a devastating shipwreck, only to realize he was the one who had intentionally drilled the holes in the hull. The sheer magnitude of his blindness had finally caught up to him. He had alienated his only daughter, ignored the horrific danger to his disabled nephew, and actively aided a career criminal in an attempt to dismantle his own mother's historic legacy. Staring at his trembling hands, the silence in the room pressed down on him like physical weights. Gently placing her hand on my shoulder, Olive stepped out into the hallway, giving me a moment of profound, necessary privacy. Reaching into the inside pocket of my blazer, I withdrew a small, cream-colored envelope sealed with Eleanor's classic wax stamp. It was not a legal document or a financial directive. It was the final, handwritten letter my grandmother had penned just days before she fell into the coma. She had instructed Olive to give it to me, to be handed to Asher only when the illusion of his toxic marriage was finally, completely shattered. Sliding the envelope across the glass table, Asher looked at it for a long time before his trembling fingers finally broke the seal. I watched his eyes scan the familiar, elegant handwriting of the woman who had spent her entire life trying to protect him from his own profound weakness. Autumn did not use the letter to scream at him from beyond the grave, refusing to hurl insults or express vicious anger. She wrote with the devastating, quiet sorrow of a mother who had finally accepted her son's tragic limitations. She wrote that she loved him, but that love could no longer blind her to the danger he posed to the truly vulnerable, explaining that she had hidden the $80 million not to punish him, but because his desperate, hollow need for validation made him a lethal threat to Aaron's survival. She told him that true family requires immense courage, and his cowardice had nearly cost a disabled child his only sanctuary. Pressing his face into his hands, the paper crumpling beneath his grip, a low, agonizing sob tore through his chest, echoing loudly in the cold, empty corporate room. Watching him break completely, I felt absolutely nothing. 7 months later, the dense coastal fog rolling over Monterey Bay felt fundamentally different. No longer a heavy, suffocating shroud, it was a crisp, refreshing mist that brought the rich scent of salt and blooming seagrass into the estate. The horrific storm Hannah had brought into our lives had completely dissipated, leaving behind a profound, unshakable tranquility. Standing on the expansive wooden terrace, holding a steaming mug of black coffee, I watched the morning light catch the jagged edges of the coastal cliffs. The $80 million sanctuary had never looked more beautiful. The quiet, relentless machinery of the justice system had moved exactly as Olive predicted. The moment the forged supplemental will was introduced into the official mediation record, it triggered an automatic, mandatory review by state investigators, pulling on that single thread of medical fraud. Hannah's entire criminal history unraveled in spectacular fashion. The quiet civil settlements from Nevada and Arizona were forcefully reopened by federal prosecutors looking into interstate wire fraud and systemic elder abuse. Currently sitting in a federal detention center, utterly stripped of her designer suits and manipulative charm, Hannah awaited a trial she had absolutely no hope of winning. But my focus was no longer on her destruction. My entire existence was now dedicated to the quiet, brilliant life happening inside the estate. Walking back inside and heading down the sunlit corridor to Aaron's specialized wing, the heavy medical equipment still hummed its steady, reassuring rhythm. But the atmosphere was completely transformed. Sitting by his massive observation window, happily tapping a colorful wooden block against the glass, as a pod of dolphins breached the surface of the bay far below. Aaron was thriving. His immune system was stable, his smile was bright, and the terrifying threat of being ripped from his home was permanently erased. Having officially assumed my role as the legal trustee, I didn't let a single cent of Eleanor's fortune sit idle. We were not just preserving the estate, we were actively expanding its mission, utilizing a portion of the trust's passive income. I formally broke ground on the Autumn Dawson Marine Conservation Center, transforming the lower acres of the property into an elite, fully funded research facility for independent marine biologists, actively protecting the fragile ecosystems of the bay. We were honoring my grandmother's brilliant patents by turning them into actionable environmental defense. The estate was no longer a quiet fortress waiting to be attacked. Thriving and generating life, every time I walked through the newly renovated laboratories or watched Aaron safely play in his environmentally controlled garden, I felt the immense, comforting presence of my grandmother, engineering a masterpiece of legal and financial protection. She ensured that the wealth she built would serve as a permanent shield for the people who truly deserved it. We had built something beautiful. Asher's divorce from Hannah was finalized in a matter of weeks, expedited heavily by her sudden transition into federal custody. The process left him emotionally gutted and financially drained, forcing him to move into a modest, quiet apartment in a neighboring coastal town. He did not try to fight the parameters of the irrevocable trust, nor did he make any pathetic attempts to reclaim the $80 million he had so willingly almost handed over to a criminal. The devastating truth of Eleanor's final letter had fundamentally broken his fragile ego, forcing him to finally seek the intensive psychological therapy he had spent his entire adult life avoiding. Coming to the estate on a crisp Tuesday afternoon, he stood at the edge of the driveway, looking significantly older, his shoulders lacking the arrogant, defensive posture he had constantly adopted when Hannah was standing by his side. Watching through the reinforced glass windows of the annex as I helped Aaron construct a massive, intricate tower out of his wooden blocks, Asher did not step onto the grass. He did not presume he had the right to walk freely into the sanctuary he had so casually almost destroyed. Waiting patiently by his car until I stepped out onto the gravel path to meet him, he asked, his voice trembling slightly, if we could ever find a way to start over. He spoke about his deep regrets, his overwhelming guilt, and his desperate desire to eventually be a grandfather figure to Aaron and a real father to me. 10 years ago, I would have immediately crumbled. Swallowing my anger, I would have accepted his apologies without condition and invited him inside to maintain the illusion of a happy family. I would have let the invisible chain of filial loyalty drag me right back into his toxic cycle of emotional dependence. But I was no longer that accommodating, quiet girl. Looking at the man who had shared his DNA with me, I established a boundary made of absolute steel. I told him that unconditional forgiveness is a dangerous myth designed to protect the people who cause the most harm. Agreeing to let him visit, the terms were non-negotiable. He was allowed on the property exactly one afternoon a month. Every single visit would be strictly supervised by me. There would be no unannounced arrivals, no demands for financial assistance, and absolutely no emotional manipulation, making it exceptionally clear that these visits were entirely contingent upon his continued, documented attendance in deep psychological therapy. I warned him, if he missed his sessions, or if he ever brought an ounce of toxicity back onto this sacred ground, the heavy iron gates of the estate would close permanently. Nodding slowly, tears welling in his tired eyes, he accepted the harsh reality of the consequences he had earned. Understanding that earning his way back into our lives would take years of silent, consistent effort, I drew the absolute line. The coastal wind whipped my hair across my face as I stood on the highest, most isolated cliff of the estate, looking out over the endless expanse of the dark Pacific Ocean. It was the exact spot where we had scattered Eleanor's ashes nearly a year ago, holding a small, delicate bundle of dried seagrass and white lilies. I placed them gently on the weathered stone marker that bore her name. The air was incredibly peaceful, completely devoid of the suffocating tension that had defined those horrific weeks when Hannah was pacing through our halls. The sanctuary was entirely secure. Standing there for a long time, listening to the rhythmic, powerful crashing of the waves below, I thought about the sheer brilliance of the woman who had raised me. Autumn had understood a profound truth about human nature that most people spend their entire lives aggressively ignoring. She knew that wealth is not a magical cure for toxicity, and that bloodlines do not automatically guarantee loyalty. Facing her own mortality with cold, calculating precision, she built an impenetrable corporate fortress to ensure that the weak would not be devoured by the greedy. Looking back toward the sprawling, beautiful estate, I could see the soft, warm lights glowing from Aaron's medical wing, a quiet beacon of absolute safety. I could see the newly constructed laboratories of the Conservation Center, where passionate young scientists were already analyzing the oceanic data that Autumn had spent decades collecting. Everything she had loved was thriving, completely insulated from the predatory forces of the outside world. I had successfully navigated the darkest storm of my life without compromising my integrity, my career, or the safety of the boy who depended on me. People often ask me if the massive $80 million inheritance changed who I fundamentally am. The truth is, the money itself meant nothing to me. The true inheritance was the immense, unyielding strength required to wield that wealth properly. My grandmother did not leave me a fortune so I could live a life of shallow luxury. She left it to me because she knew I possessed the steel necessary to defend it against those who would exploit it. She taught me that sometimes the most profound act of love is preparing for war. Smiling, I whispered a quiet thank you to the cold ocean wind. Legacy isn't just what you inherit, it's the boundaries you draw and the people you protect. If this story resonated with you, and you believe that true family is about protection, not just blood, let me know your favorite part in the comments. Subscribe for more stories every single day.